Welcome to this edition of the Kids Ministry Collective podcast, where we talk about topics and resources that help you lead more to reach more. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this edition of the Kids Ministry Collective podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Kids Ministry Collective podcast. My name's Tom Bump, and I'm your host. Thanks for joining me, my friends. I'm excited to get this episode started with you. In fact, let me start this episode off with a statement and a question, kind of both. Today's world is changing faster and faster, and not always for the better. I mean, there are good things that come with change, but there's some things that aren't so great. And we're seeing such changes happen, not just in our world, but really within generations. We're seeing huge mindset and value shifts, identity crisis, and much, much more with this next generation. And so today's leaders really do need to be prepared to meet head on this next generation and understand what changes are happening and get out in front. We cannot be behind on this, especially when it comes to sharing the gospel. So before we start, maybe you're a leader that statement right there just made you feel very unprepared, and maybe you're unsure how to handle some of these changes, or maybe there's a lot of things in leadership right now that you're struggling with and you just aren't sure how to do it and you feel very alone. Well, that's why I want to recommend KMCcoach.net. It's a top-tier coaching program that helps meet you where you are. You start off with an assessment about you and your ministry, and then it builds a custom journey that moves you from self-doubt to confidence. So you can go from being unsure in your direction to taking real next steps and seeing the fruit come from your ministry. So to see if this would be a good fit for you, head over to KMCcoach.net, schedule a clarity call. It's 30 minutes long. It'll help you assess whether this is a right fit for you, and you'll get your questions answered and see which program journey fits you and your budget for your ministry. So don't be overwhelmed. Stop leading alone. Lean in to some other experience and grow yourself and grow your ministry. All right, let's jump into today's episode. I want to introduce to you a new friend of mine to the Kid Ministry Collective. Her name is Janine McNally, and she is a professor and an author, and I'll let her tell her story a little bit in just a second. But she's got a fabulous new book that's soon to be released right around the time of this podcast here at the end of April 2023, 1st of May. And so you're definitely going to want to check this out. I highly recommend it because it's going to help you answer some of these questions about this next generation. Her book's called When You See Fireflies, Helping Leaders and Parents Minister More Effectively to Generation Alpha. And welcome to the KMC, Janine. It's so good to have you on.
Thanks, Tom. I'm glad to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, because I think a lot of people haven't met you yet and they don't know about your ministry. So fill us in a little bit about who you are.
Sure. Well, you probably can't tell from my voice that I'm from Australia, but I am. I was originally a high school teacher, came over to America to study my Master of Theology at Dallas Theological Seminary, which is where I met my husband, Gary. We have been working for 30 plus years now in youth and pastoral and church planting ministry, and then most recently children's ministry. When I stepped out from children's ministry a year and a half ago, I began the nonprofit Grace for Kids, and the focus of that is to produce gospel-centered resources for kids ministry. Now I'm also finishing up my doctoral degree, and I'm teaching children's ministry, which is really cool, at my school, Grace School of Theology in Houston, Texas. It's the first time they've had any kinds of classes for kids ministry, so that's really great. I'll be teaching grad and undergrad classes in a couple of weeks, actually. We're starting.
That is fabulous. I'm super excited about that. We need to see more schools teaching. There was a while that it was out there, and then they kind of disappeared. And I'm glad to hear that some are coming back or starting new ones, because it is much, much needed. Well, you know that we always start off the Kid Ministry Collective podcast with a why question. So here comes your why. I'm curious, why did you choose to write about Generation Alpha? What was the draw for you? What led you to this journey?
Well, I was preparing my classes that I'm going to be teaching. This was last year. I like to prepare well in advance. And I thought, well, I'll just turn this into a book because that's what everybody does, right? They just turn their class into a book. And then I thought, no, that would be really boring because everybody's already written about children's ministry. So I continued to read and research, and I came along a footnote that the footnote said it was an article said Understanding Generation Alpha. And believe it or not, it was written by a professor of psychology in India. How I bumped into that, I don't know, but I read it and I thought, Generation Alpha, who are they? So that kind of got me started researching that, and then putting that together with the fact that we're losing kids and their families at an alarming rate. It really just rang bells in my head, and I thought, I got to do that one. That's what I'm going to write about. So that's where it came from.
All right. Interesting. Because the other part that intrigued me was the title, When You See Fireflies.
Yeah.
How'd you come up with that? What's the story behind that?
Yeah, funny thing, I didn't come up with it. I was going to call it some bland name, and my oldest daughter, she said, Mom, why don't you call it When You See Fireflies? And I was like, huh? She said, remember when we were little and we lived in Pennsylvania, we would go outside to play, and we said to you, when do we have to come in? And you would say, when you see fireflies, because our backyard would fill with them. It was at the back, it was marshy and dense forest. And they would come out and it's obvious when they light up the darkness, you can't miss them. And so she said, we didn't have a watch or a phone or anything like that. So you use that as a way to get our attention. Now's the time to come in. It's getting dark. And I was like, oh, I like it. So that's where it came from. There are a lot of illustrations coming from that, like fireflies only glow for a short time, so the need is urgent. And so I see children's ministry workers as the firefly, taking the light out into the darkness and drawing the kids back inside where it's safe. So yeah, that's where it came from.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I love the story. And yeah, I grew up in that. It was when you see the street lights come on.
Yeah, exactly.
We were outside until the street lights came on, and sometimes a little after. And so when the fireflies came out, then we really knew, we better get home or we're gonna get in trouble.
Yep.
But yeah, that was quite, those were the days, that's for sure. So let's dive into the book a little bit, but before we do get too deep in, we obviously need to define what Generation Alpha is and who are they and what are they like? What's the main characteristics? Because, everybody, when you say millennials, pictures pop up in their head, but Generation Alpha is a new term. And I don't know how many leaders are really, truly, tuned into this yet. So, they should be, we all should be, but how do you define it, and what's some of their main characteristics?
Well, when I first started researching it, I noticed everybody was talking still about Generation Z, even youth ministry leaders. And when I looked them up, Generation Alpha are born between 2010 and 2024. So if you do your math, the oldest of them are turning 13 this year. So they are the kids we have in children's ministry, not Gen Z. And it was interesting, as I did my research, Generation Alpha, that term was actually designated by an Australian. Yee, woo. He's a social research analyst. His name is Mark McCrindle. He is a believer, and he's done a lot of research on this generation. So a lot of the information, if you Google Generation Alpha, or go on Amazon, he has an excellent book that he wrote about it, but it wasn't within Christian circles specifically. I contacted him and I said, have you done any research regarding children's ministry, or whether it's the same over here in the States as it is in Australia? And he said, it's definitely the same in the States, but we have not touched on children's ministry. So that's when I thought, oh, goodness, that's what I want to do. So by the time they're finished their generation, there will be 2.5 there's more than 2.5 million born every day, so more than 2 billion
Wow.
in this generation. My favorite alphas have just been born. Our daughter gave birth to two twin alpha boys.
There you
So they're
go.
very special to me. But the distinction for them is that they were born into a world of technology. If
Hmm.
you think back to your older kids, they probably got a phone when they were late teens or a laptop for school when they were in their late teens, early 20s or whatever. These kids are born and we shove an iPad into their hand.
Yep.
I was at a restaurant the other day, and you know how they normally bring out like coloring sheets and crayons with the menu on the other side. They
Yep.
did that, and that was pushed to the side, and both of the little girls were playing on iPads.
Yep.
That's who they are. They were born into a world full of technology. They will never experience what it is like to dial a phone, send a fax, type on a typewriter, take a photograph with film. So CDs, VHSs, even DVDs, they're all going by the wayside now. And these kids, they were 2010 was actually the year that iPads were first created, which is kind of ironic because that's the start of their generation. But they will be all big into this artificial intelligence, robotics, remote medicine, remote education, 3D printing, all those kinds of things. So yeah, they're unique in that no one else has ever had that scenario
Yeah.
being born into that.
Yeah. It's very true. When I was teaching not that long ago, and I pulled out a Palm Pilot.
What's that?
And these kids looked at that and were like, what is that?
Mm-hmm.
And then I had a walkie-talkie, and they were like, what is that thing?
Yeah.
And and then of course I brought out my Atari joystick, and
Mm-hmm.
some of them caught that one because they've seen their parents playing around with.
Video games, yep.
But I'm like, yeah, when we first had, I mean, well, when I actually, and I've misplaced it, but I have one of the original. It was called Pong, and it was just this little controller that all you did, you had to spin
Oh
the
wow.
knob. You turned the knob, and that was it. That was the only thing you
Mm-hmm.
could do. I mean, I think it did have some buttons on the side, but you played this a couple, like three games on your TV with that thing. And that was, I think, our first game system. And yeah, and now, yes, you look at it and go, these kids are playing stuff on the iPad that I'm just like, how are you doing that?
Yep.
And their controller, I mean, yeah, they're not watching even regular TV. Everything's streamed on YouTube, and that's
Yes.
where they get all their info. And
Yep.
yeah, it's crazy to imagine that, yeah, this generation has no clue what a corded telephone is and what call waiting is or dial up.
Yeah. Yep.
Boy, am I aging myself. But it's fascinating because you're right, this generation has become quite the digital generation. It's also, been labeled very high anxiety, and
Mm.
stress is
Yes.
also one of their labels coming through, now, for some of them in the middle of their lifespan or early lifespan, it's the pandemic. So it's interesting to see some of that. So, in your book, you share about some of the variety of influences that have impacted this generation. How have those things impacted the kids, and why exactly are they powerful influencers in that?
Well, you mentioned a couple of them already. So our youngest is about to graduate from college. She's an early graduate. She's only 18, and she would tell us stories of her friends. It's a Christian university she attended, and a good one too. But she would be telling us constantly stories about girls that were cutting themselves, threatening suicide. They were having panic attacks, and just a list of things basically related to anxiety. And I said, Jamie, what on earth is going on out there? She said, well, Mom,
Yeah.
look at the world we're growing up in. And she's got a point, I mean, I think it's chapter 2 in my book. It says, what a wonderful world. Well, our world from this perspective is not so wonderful anymore. There is so much going on with mass shootings and violence and wars and gender confusion and sex trafficking and fentanyl over. I mean, there is so many things bad just in the actual world. And then add to that COVID, of course, and the experts say that COVID will have a significant impact and be a defining moment for this generation of Generation Alpha. They call them COVID babies. And they say that the younger you are when something like that happens, the more it will impact you. So we're adding in this horrible couple of years where face masks and isolation were the thing. And who knows, I think we've yet to grasp the full extent of what that's doing to this generation.
Right.
And then, of course, technology. Well, we can see these kids running around with an iPad and get frustrated. But think about it. During COVID, what did they have to do? Their schools closed and they had to go on a screen. Their parents were busy trying to work, and so it was also their childcare. So we've shoved it into their hands by necessity. Plus, they're naturally, they're just natural with it. I don't know if you've watched. Well, when something goes wrong, who do you call? Your teenage kid, right?
Yeah.
They just naturally know how to do it. So if you add that to everything else, that's what's happening to them.
Yeah. So I'm going to go a little off script here. So when you see that, well, maybe it's not necessarily off script because we were going to talk about the next thing is how should the church be leaning into this? Because, you mentioned several times in the book of how, we've got more resources than we've ever had. And yet, you look at that and then you go, well, we've had more technology than we've ever had.
Right.
And both of them, we see a spiritual disconnect. We see a relational spiritual disconnect. So what should church leaders understand? How do we engage this generation when they're electronically disconnected, they're spiritually disconnected? What should we be looking at and thinking about when it comes to this generation?
Oh gosh, yeah. So the research tells us that the kids and their parents see the church as being irrelevant, being untrustworthy, and therefore not worthy of belief. So taking the first one, irrelevant, I'm thinking to myself, how on earth could we be irrelevant? We have the answer to all of these issues, and yet they're seeing it as being irrelevant. And what it boiled down to in my mind is that we're teaching the story of Noah without telling the kids to think through how must Noah have felt when the whole town was laughing at him. How might that? So we're teaching the Bible story, but we're not translating it into real life issues. Do you think maybe he might have been bullied or abused verbally, laughed at, mocked? Obviously, we don't talk about that and then translating that into what should we do when that happens at school. So the world is out there aggressively teaching their secular worldview, and we're teaching nice Bible stories. Which is great, but we're not addressing their hurts or talking about the answers to them. Therefore, we're irrelevant. So they want answers to why am I feeling this way? Why is Mary now Mark? Why is Steve wearing a dress? And we're, talking about Esther, but we don't talk about the fact that she stood up and it was to the point of death. How can we translate that into real life? So to me, that's the first one. We are not being relevant in that respect. As for trust, millennials especially do not trust institutions, and that carries over into churches. And when you look at what's going on in churches, we are hypocritical. I mean, we're sinners. So looking at Christians is not a great place to look anyway. But there's politics, moral failures, church splits. We argue over the color of the carpet while people are hurting in the community, and the homeless shelters are bursting at the seams. So their trust has been broken. They also prioritize safety and security. I think we do pretty well with that with kids. We've pretty much got that down with our security systems.
Mhm.
But that's a really big deal for them, their trust. They're not going to put their children in a ministry where the church is not united, or has ripples, undercurrents going through, which sound like some of those things. So when you put those two together, the conclusion is they don't believe anymore. They don't believe in the church, and even worse, they don't believe that God has anything to offer, or he doesn't exist either. And I think that comes back to our world and its view of relativism. There is no longer any universal code of belief.
Yeah.
And so, what's good for you is good for me. If I'm okay, you're okay. All that's nothing right, not wrong or right, no black and white. So they're going through those situations. How do we compensate for that? How do we respond? I really think it's important. First of all, we need to focus on relationships. You talked about technology. You're right. We have all of the systems down. We've got our, flashing lights and our great backdrops and stuff like that. But what the kids really need is a friend, a mentor, someone older that they can trust to talk to about these issues. And then I think also we need to have them experience God for themselves. It's great when it's up in their head, but it needs to translate that 12 inches down into the heart.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk in my book about how we can do that. What are some ways that we can convert this head knowledge into real life experience? It was a couple of years ago when our youngest was, I think she was probably 13. We were starting a new midweek program at our church, and it was our first night coming up. And she said, "Mom, I am going to pray for 9 girls in my group." Well, we had divided the audience, the hopeful audience, into 4 groups. There was younger boys, younger girls, older girls. She had the older girl class, and she said, "I want 9." And I'm thinking to myself, well, if I average that out, that's 36 kids. I'd be lucky. I'd be thrilled if we got 20, because it's our first time. This has never been done before. So I'm like, oh, what do I say to her? I don't want to flatten her enthusiasm, but at the same time, I don't want her grossly disappointed. So I said, James, I think it'd be great, go ahead and pray for that. But, don't expect, and I could hear myself saying what I shouldn't be saying. Well, during the week, we had about, I think it was 4 or 5 signed up, and I was thrilled. She was not. She said, "I'm still praying, Mom. I want that 9. For some reason, she had that number in her head. And the night of the event, she had 7 that had finally signed up at the last minute. We had 7. And she's like, "Not good enough." She was miserable. And I remember sitting at the check-in desk. We got everything set up, and the phone rings. And I pick up the phone, and it's a mom. I didn't know who she was, never heard from her. She wasn't one of our church families. She said, "Hey, I just wanted to know if it was too late to bring 2 of my kids along to your program tonight." And I said, "No, not at all." I said, what are their ages and genders?" She said, "It's 2 girls in 4th and 5th grade. And I'm like, that made 9. And that experience in Jamie's life, she will never forget it, because she tested the waters. She prayed like she'd never prayed before. God answered her prayers, and she experienced God for herself. And if you met her on the street and you said, "What was one of the best things that ever happened during that program?" she would tell you, "When I prayed for 9 girls." And that's what we need to do. Somehow we have to figure out a way to have our kids experience God for themselves. And again, like I said, I talk about a lot of different suggested ways. My book is filled with there are statistics, and it will depress you, because that's where the world is at. But then it turns a corner and gives a whole bunch of different suggestions on what you could try depending on where you're at and stuff. So,
and that's what I loved about it. I think I told you that in person. Is it's so practical that this really does. It's a wake-up call. It's a reality check, which we all need, because we get too comfortable. And to me, it gives every leader, regardless of what context you're serving in, whatever community context you have, it's giving you a challenge to think about the what ifs and the what could we do's.
Mm.
and really leading you to what should you be doing, and what should you put out in front, is a high priority, because I've said this multiple times on this podcast. I feel like as the body of Christ, we have missed an opportunity to take something so terrible as a pandemic,
Mm.
and we started all this creativity, even though a lot of it was really reactionary. We were reacting to what was happening. We didn't have time to respond. It was a reaction. So we started creating all this stuff. We started doing new things and innovative things. And honestly, we were drawing in people and even children that hadn't been reached by the church previously. And then as soon as the pandemic supposedly has gone away, we went right back to the old stuff.
Right.
And then people wonder, why aren't people coming back to church, and why aren't we
Yeah.
drawing more children? And now some areas, I mean, I will say it's not like that everywhere. There are lots of churches that are seeing an influx and people are coming, but that's what I loved about your book, was the fact that you do turn that corner to say, hey, look, I'm going to give you a blueprint. I'm going to give you some things to think through for your culture and context, because we need to wake up to this. We need to get the church is often, we're so slow and we're behind, culture has shifted and we're catching up.
Mm-hmm.
And it and that's, we've got a God who's a bit ahead of culture,
Yep.
who
Yep.
knew all this beforehand. And yet, why is that? Anyway, that's a whole nother podcast. Um,
Yep.
so as you're looking at all of this, what are some things that leaders really need to start doing or getting right? Give us one or two things. Obviously, I want people to grab the book because you got a whole lot more to talk about in there, but pick one or two things that you think a leader should be thinking through and understanding if they're going to be relevant and they're going to reach this generation. What do they need to be doing?
I think my biggest takeaway from the whole thing that I learned was our preteens. So I read while I was researching that if you looked at the brain scans of preschoolers, 3 to 4 year olds, they are nearly identical to that of an 11 or 12-year-old. The brains look the same because they are both going into stages of life where major change is happening. We already knew that about our preschoolers, but the preteens are getting ready for youth and adulthood. And they go through a phase called cognitive, oh goodness, now I've forgotten the word, cognitive pruning, where they cut out from their lives the things that they deem unnecessary to make room for what they believe is right and relevant and true.
Wow.
What we need to do is make sure they're not cutting or pruning God out of their lives. And that, because they're so malleable at that stage, I believe they're as receptive as preschoolers. They're the kids that we need to focus on. The fact that they are so technologically involved is actually making them extremely lonely. Those so-called relationships on social media are not real. And
Right.
what they long for is real relationships. So focusing on that, plus the fact that they are transitioning from concrete to abstract thinking, and they're so visual with the touch screens and the apps and everything. We need to change what we're doing with those kids. A lot of churches, I'm sure, are already doing this, but like the 3rd through 5th graders need to, instead of having linear teaching with a monologue up the front lecturing the class, they need to turn the chairs into circles and have the kids talking and discussing and solving problems for themselves. Instead of telling them the answers, we throw out a problem and let them think it through to get their answers. I really think that that's one way we can prep our preteens for the beginning of that transition into adulthood. And I think they're at the greatest risk for pruning God out of their lives.
Yeah.
So that would be my priority.
Ooh, that's a good one right there. Wow. So, what surprised you most as you started learning about this generation? What surprised you? What was like, whoa, that kind of jarred you a little bit?
I think it was kind of like what I just said. It's not just even technology, it's the touch screens. They are very hands-on, and the way they learn is different, because they're visual. And I think that was probably most of what I read sort of just went, yep, that makes sense. That makes sense. I can see that everywhere, you know. So it was, in one sense, it was predictable. What was more important was, what do we do about it? How do we do it? And I think probably the second biggest, maybe the biggest thing is, I was in a fairly large church last year helping out with the VBS program, a couple of hundred kids. And I asked the children's pastor, would you mind if I do a survey of your kids? And he said, sure. And so I got all the teachers, all the leaders of the VBS to ask the kids on their own, individually, one question: how do we get to heaven? And out of 200 of these kids, most of them involved in the church already, only 30 knew the actual gospel message, that because Jesus died for my sins, if I believe that, I go to heaven. And I think in our stress and overload and COVID, and I don't know about you, but when I was in kids ministry, I was literally running flat out from the time I stepped foot in the church till the minute I shut the lights out. I was running. The other staff were sitting down, having coffee, chatting on the phone. And I literally was going backwards and forwards from my office to the resource room, backwards and forwards all the time, running like crazy. I think we're all so busy that we can lose sight of the fact that we only have this short period of time, maybe 1 hour a week, if we're lucky, to invest in these kids. And so therefore, every single thing we do with them, we need to build the gospel into it somehow, so that by the time they finish, they know it. They may not, we can't press them to believe it, but they at least know what the gospel is. And I think that may be an area that we're not doing so well at.
I agree. I can't push back on that one, because I wholeheartedly agree. I was just speaking, I did a next gen retreat here recently, and I had somebody ask me, what would you do if you were going to start over? If you were going to start children's and student ministry over again, what would you do differently, or what would you do stronger even now? And I said, well, it's something that I've always been committed to, but it would be even more so of presenting the gospel loud, clear, simple, over and over and over again. And like you said, getting kids in a group and asking them that kind of a question, and asking them to process it for themselves. And what does that look like? And how does even the gospel conflict with what they're hearing out in the world today? That brings them hope and joy and peace, because there's all those things that offer, that they think offer them, ultimate salvation personally, and they're missing the truth. So I think that is spot on, and I hope people see that in your book loud and clear, because you really do press that home. So what do you hope that people will take away after reading the book?
That these kids, they're a moving target. Our lens might be focused on them today, and then 2 years from now, we need to adjust. And Valerie Bell, you've probably heard of her. She wrote Resilient, right? Most people know that book. It's great. She says in her book, she said, I fear that our assumption of sameness, our cluelessness in the midst of big cultural shifts, may lead us to be unresponsive to the needs that these shifts present. And I think our culture is shifting. And the biggest mistake we can make in kids ministry is to assume that programs that were successful in the past are going to be successful now. I know we're busy. I know we're going nonstop, but somewhere we need to stop for a second, think, how do we need to adjust our focus on this new generation?
Yeah. And I don't know about you, but one of the things that's come on my radar recently is the fact that we also can't label. I mean, we tend to label this generation in a big, span, but there's a lot of micro generations creeping into these other generations.
Sure.
And I think that's what we're going to see too, is that you have that period of 3 to 5 years or a little bit longer, with the pandemic kids, the COVID babies. But inside their generation is going to come a post-pandemic generation.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think this book is timely. And I hope that listeners will go and grab this. How can they get a copy? Where can they go, and where can they learn more about what you do?
Well, it's not quite out yet. I'm hoping to get the advanced copies really soon, but they can go to whenyouseefireflies.com, and they can pre-order it there, and I will ship it as soon as they come in. It will eventually be up. If you Google it, or not Google it, if you search it on Amazon, you'll see it. It's there. It's just not quite, they haven't got it quite ready. It's something to do with meta stuff. I don't know. Barnes and Nobles, all those kinds of places. That it will be out there. So that's out there. And then my nonprofit, my little baby, graceforkids.com. That's where I have tried to produce resources that incorporate the gospel in everything. I use a very simple gospel outline, 4 points, 4 verses. I'm a sinner, Romans 3:23. The wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23. Jesus died on the cross, Romans 5:8. And all I have to do is believe, John 3:16. And when I was in my kids ministry position, I trained our leaders to use those 4 points and those verses all the way from preschool all the way up to preteen, so that every year they would hear the same thing over and over, and it would be consistent. So it would be easier to learn. So I've built that into everything that I've got on that website. My biggest thing that I've just finished is 6 different milestone celebrations. One of my biggest frustrations was trying to figure out how to incorporate parents into the ministry more. We all talk about partnering with parents. These 6 different milestones are created for the purpose of having a parent come with their child. So, for example, obviously not parent-child dedications. The child probably would be there, but they'd be too little. And then they have salvation when they first get their Bible, when they learn to read and they transition out of preschool, baptism, communion, and then when they graduate out of children's ministry, having an afternoon or session where you have the parent join the kids, come in, and they listen and they hear the gospel as well. So that's the latest thing I've done. But there's gospel tracks, activity books, and even a brand new VBS program. So that's graceforkids.com.
Fantastic. All right. Well, this book will be out soon, so get ready for it and get it on your order list. Or pre-order it on her website. Like she said, we'll put the links in the show notes as well, so that you can take advantage of grabbing this. But I highly recommend you read it with your team, and think through, how do we need to get ahead of this generation, and how do we need to watch as it grows and it changes? What can we do to minister and serve them well? So, well, Janine, my friend, thank you so much for taking time to join me on the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of the Kids Ministry Collective podcast. Remember, if there's anything we can do to serve you, we're here for you. If you're a hurting and burned out leader struggling with overwhelm, check out restoringleaders.org. We would love to serve you over there. kmccoach.net. If you're looking for leadership coaching you need to build, we're available for trainings and seminars, and we will come and serve you however we can. So God bless you. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing this podcast with others, and stay tuned for another episode real soon. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Kids Ministry Collective podcast. We hope that it's helped and encouraged you. If you would, support our podcast by continuing to share it with other leaders. And if you haven't already, hey, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen to this podcast. We look forward to hearing from you how this podcast has helped and sharpened your skills in ministries. So let us know on your Facebook page, or head over to kmccoach.net and share with us there. And thanks again for listening to the Kid Ministry Collective podcast.